Hi, folks. Just a quick word this week about September 11th, 2001. 9/11 represents one of those historical events that people who have lived through them generally will always remember exactly what they were doing on the day when it occurred. You could compare it with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and my father could remember precisely what he was doing that day at home. Later on, for the Kennedy assassination in 1963, my dad was driving on the road somewhere in the San Francisco area, and people had their radios on, and so they were hearing coverage live being reported out of Dallas to the major news networks, and Walter Cronkite was on air and actually announced to many Americans that President Kennedy had died at Parkland Hospital. And my father remembered that listening to the news that he pulled off the road onto the shoulder, and he said that other cars started doing it too because people were so upset that they couldn't drive safely. And many of the drivers, my dad said, were openly crying in reaction to the news that the president had been murdered. On 9/11, for people old enough to remember that day, I recall for myself that I did something on 9/11 that as best I can remember, I never did before or after. And that is that I got up that day and went immediately downstairs. We had a two-story house, and I went downstairs, and I immediately turned on the television set. And there was live coverage. The first of the Twin Towers in New York City had been hit by an aircraft. And they were providing a live feed. And I never turn on the television in the morning, ever. And since that day, I don't believe I've ever turned the TV on in the morning. So that was just a weird thing to do. But I got ready for work. I had an 8 o'clock class. Got in my car, drove out to the campus, and on public radio on the way out to school, which is a short drive from where I live, there was more coverage of what was happening. And so you had this sense that there was, something major was going down. And so I taught my first class, and immediately after that class, I went down the hall. There was a flat screen TV in the dean's office, and it was on, and there was coverage. I think the first tower was hit, but the second tower had not yet collapsed. And so I had another class, went back to class. At 10 o'clock, I left, went back down. And then the news was that the Twin Towers had collapsed. I think I had a third class, and like half the students showed up because the word was getting out that something was going on. And we didn't make it to the end of class. They announced that all classes were canceled, and they closed the campus, and everyone went home. And so over the next couple of days, it was eerie because there was no aircraft in the sky. Basically, the federal government grounded all aircraft. And so normally, in the morning or when you come home in the afternoon, you can see where jets have crossed the skies and left trails, and nothing, no aircraft at all. And of course, it took a while before Al-Qaeda, the terrorist network that masterminded the attacks, actually took credit. So there was like a big pause in which nobody knew who had attacked the United States, but it was clear that we were going to war. And the other thing that happened on that day was President Bush was visiting a grade school class, and aides came in and they whispered into the president's ear, and that's on video. You can watch it on YouTube. And the president's face kind of, his expression, it's like his eyes, kind of his whole expression, you can tell something's going down. And he sort of abruptly leaves the classroom, and he's taken away. And the president says no one knew what was going on, and no one knew if this was a prelude to World War III. The president was taken to Air Force One, and they did not fly him back to Washington I think he was flown way up into the northern plains to like a remote Air Force base. And so there was a period of time in which the president was in the air, but people didn't know exactly where he was going or what was going on. And so um, that's one of those events that is kind of seared in your brain, and it completely altered what would have been the course of George W. Bush's presidency. He did not run on the war on terror or on foreign affairs. He focused mainly on domestic policy, and something called compassionate conservatism. I'm not sure what that was because after the attacks of 9/11, everything went over to national security and the war on terrorism, and ultimately wars in first Afghanistan and then Iraq or Iraq, yeah. And so and those wars drug on all the way through the end of the second Bush's presidency. And so we had the passage of the Patriot Act, and so unprecedented levels of federal surveillance of American citizens inside the United States, which, prior to that point, that kind of intense monitoring would have been illegal. And we still have the Patriot Act today. I don't think it's been ever reversed. So we still live in a country now where potentially your emails and all your other kinds of communications are likely being monitored by giant computers that are looking for, certain expressions or certain words that, those messages are going to be culled out and then analyzed probably first by AI and then ultimately by people. One thing that's significant about 9/11 too is how rapidly there were conspiracy theories that still linger. And I think people have trouble accepting that that something as massive as the attacks on the Pentagon and World Trade Center and other American targets on that day, that somehow the government missed it, or that people in the know didn't know it was coming. And what I believe is that there was evidence out there, but it was mixed in with literally, probably billions of other pieces of information spread between multiple intelligence agencies that in that period didn't share information. And so it's only after the fact that I think you could go back knowing what happened and say, here's another, clue or another fact which indicates the coming of this major attack on the United States. But at the time, it was literally like a needle in a haystack. The same kind of conspiracy theories have been applied to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And there was a book that came out in the late 40s or early 50s by Charles S. Tansel called Backdoor to War. And it's a big, thick book. And Tansel, his whole argument is that FDR knew the Japanese were going to attack, that he wanted to get into World War II and he let it happen. The trouble with the book is that there's really no concrete evidence in all of the pages. It's all, sort of suggestion and speculation. There's no clear evidence that FDR knew. And I've always made the argument that FDR had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He loved the U.S. Navy, that he never would have allowed those battleships to be, sunk by the Japanese. That if he really, really wanted to get into the war and knew the attack was coming, you would get the fleet out to sea and make them a difficult or impossible target, and let the Japanese attack an empty harbor, and probably have your fighter planes up to shoot down a lot of them. So the idea that FDR would just sit and let these massive ships get destroyed, get sunk, doesn't make a lot of sense, in my opinion. So I guess another example of that, people just find it difficult to believe that there's sort of not this higher power at work, that there's kind of an inside story to everything. So hope you had a great week, and I will talk to you folks later.